1971 was a year which was hallmarked by many striking images. It brought fundamental realignments and upheavals, pageantry, social change, new horizons and new beginnings, unrest, technological and political breakthroughs, tension and humor, and sporting achievements to a world which would never be the same again. It was a year of contrasting memories which have been preserved here in this series for all time. During 1971, a new flag joined those flying outside the United Nations in New York. And new faces were seen in Manhattan's top hotels. Communist China was coming out of its 20-year isolation and demanding a seat at the United Nations. Despite US concern, they were voted in, and President Nixon acted swiftly to improve relations.
There can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people. I sent Dr. Kissinger, my assistant for national security affairs, to Peking for the purpose of having talks with Premier Zhou Enlai. The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Premier Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's assistant for national security affairs, held talks in Peking from July 9 to 11, 1971. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure.
While President Nixon could look forward to visiting Peking in 1972, the readmission of Communist China meant the expulsion of Formosa, or Taiwan, the nationalist regime that the United States had consistently supported since the Communists had seized mainland China. Britain had voted against American policy on the two Chinas at the UN, and ping-pong diplomacy took on a new meaning as the Communists sent over a table tennis team on a goodwill mission. In Southeast Asia, South Vietnamese troops moved into Cambodia and Laos, taking over the ground operations from American forces. The United States continued to withdraw its combat troops from Vietnam as the ARVN assumed responsibility near the demilitarized zone. By the end of the year, American combat strength had dropped to 170,000 troops, and the South Vietnamese army was proving that it could hold its own without direct American support. In Saigon, 1971 was election year, and there was only one candidate, the president, Nguyen Van Thieu. There had been two other potential candidates, General Big Min and Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky, but they dropped out because they said Thieu had rigged the elections, making meaningful opposition impossible. Despite US embassy pressure, Ky refused to reconsider, and on election day there was only one candidate, President Thieu. President Thieu was re-elected by 93% of those who voted. In Cambodia, the military situation worsened. President Lon Nol called for an all-out effort against the Khmer Rouge, and his forces launched an attack to reopen Route 6 north of Phnom Penh. they suffered a massive defeat. The South Vietnamese army then crossed into Cambodia in an attempt to divert the communists from Phnom Penh, but they too met with little success. In America itself, the war in Southeast Asia left a bitter aftertaste. At Fort Benning in Georgia, Lieutenant William Calley was found guilty of killing 22 South Vietnamese civilians at My Lai. Originally sentenced to life imprisonment, he was confined to the Fort Benning stockade. But President Nixon, responding to public outcry, promised to review the case personally. A military review board subsequently reduced the sentence to 20 years. Another My Lai figure, Captain Ernest Medina, Calley's commanding officer, was cleared of all charges. Vietnam veterans staged protests against American policy in Southeast Asia. They went to Washington to lobby congressmen and senators. Some went to the Pentagon to hand in decorations they'd won in the war. It was a quiet but effective demonstration. There were other mass protests against the war, most of them orderly. One, though, was not. Radicals, calling themselves the May Day Tribe, threatened to shut down Washington. They tried to block traffic using their own bodies, rubbish bins, and wrecked cars. Thousands were arrested by police and herded off to jail. 1971 was the year of the Pentagon Papers trial. Dr. Daniel Ellsberg, a former Pentagon official, had released to the New York Times a Department of Defense study of the Vietnam War. Ellsberg was charged with illegally possessing and copying government papers. At first, the report in the New York Times drew little attention, but when the Supreme Court upheld freedom of the press, other newspapers published their own reports. The Department of Defense finally released 2 copies of the study to Congress. In the United States during 1971, there were over 600 prisoners on death row, condemned to die for murder, kidnapping, or rape. Death row at San Quentin and other prisons was packed to capacity. This man, Robert Wellesley Wells, had spent 7 years on death row. On the morning of his execution, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment.
I have the dubious distinction of being the only man that walked in one door of the gas chamber department and walked out the other door. When I was due to be executed about 10 hours before, 12 hours before my execution, I had a stay of execution. A writ of habeas corpus was granted. I went in the gas chamber, sit down in the chair, looked at the slot that drops the pill, walked out and told the guard, I hope I never see this place again. Let's go.
Also in San Quentin, Black Panther George Jackson, 2 prisoners and 3 warders were killed in what the authorities said was an escape attempt. At his funeral, the Black Panthers accused the authorities of murder. In Attica, New York, prison violence exploded as the authorities refused to consider inmates' complaints. 1,000 prisoners took 37 guards hostage and held them for 4 days. New and more militant demands were put forward, including amnesty for their acts of defiance. 20 outside observers, including lawyer William Kunstler and Black Panther Bobby Seale, attempted to mediate. But the amnesty condition proved a stumbling block. Police and National Guardsmen moved in. Prisoners held knives at the throats of their hostages. As helicopters poured down clouds of tear gas, police marksmen opened fire on the prisoners, threatening the guards. Within minutes, 40 men, including 9 of the hostages, were killed. At first, prison officials reported that the dead guards' throats had been cut, but the coroner's report later confirmed that all the deaths had been caused by police gunfire. In America, it was a year of belt-tightening as President Nixon introduced price controls.
A freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days. I am today imposing an additional tax of 10% on goods imported into the United States.
The new surcharge was intended to end the trade deficit that threatened the value of the dollar. Wall Street reacted strongly to the president's message. The effects of the surcharge were felt around the world. The mark and the yen were revalued, and American Treasury Secretary Connolly attended a series of meetings with the monetary leaders of the world. The threat of further price controls succeeded in slowing down domestic inflation, but the trade unions complained of unfair treatment. The coast-to-coast dock strike added to the problems of the United States economy for much of 1971. The effect of the dollar crisis was worldwide.
Well, the French have not to choose a solution to a handmade German crisis. I think some sort of control in Germany would be the greatest help. Little sorrowful to be aware that the Germans have not the same maturity in the financial and monetary field, which they have showed so magnificently in industrial field in other level. And the difference have always been there, but on 2 points. What to do about the dollar and the dollar invasion, what to do about the pound. It has nothing to do within the common market, so there is nothing new in that field, please.
The West German Chancellor, Willy Brandt, flew to London for talks with British Treasury officials. Financial discussions continued at crisis pitch in most European capitals throughout the year. The money markets were in a state of confusion. London was no exception. Business was brisk, but not always profitable.
Frankly, it's been a bit of both. There's certainly been chaos trying to find out what the rates were. At the same time, the amount of business has been an anticlimax. The inquiries and number of deals have been quite numerous, but the amounts in which we have dealt have been smaller.
1971 saw India and Pakistan at war again for the third time in 25 years. The trouble started when the Punjabis of West Pakistan refused to give the Bengalis of East Pakistan autonomy. Riots broke out, and the Bengalis, led by Mujibur Rahman, demanded their own state, Bangladesh. West Pakistan responded with force. 80,000 Punjabi troops ruthlessly suppressed the Bengali liberation movement. Martial law was introduced, and troops were given a free hand to crush the rebellion. East Pakistan was devastated, and as many as 100,000 Bengalis were killed. Towns and cities were destroyed, and the Bangladesh guerrillas were forced into the countryside. Between 9 and 10 million Bengalis fled to India, carrying with them the few possessions they'd managed to save. India was unable to cope with the burden and threatened to take military action. She armed the Bangladesh guerrillas and built up her own military strength along her border with East Pakistan. After a number of skirmishes, full-scale war broke out. The Indian army broke through the East Pakistan defenses, capturing the town of Jessore, where they were greeted as liberators. By the end of the year, Indian troops were close to achieving their commander's objectives.
My aim is to make Pakistan armed forces surrender, and I'll have to carry on this operation, or I would like to carry on this operation till they surrender and give up fighting.
1971 was a year of travel for the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, who left his native country for the first time in his long reign. His first stop was Anchorage in Alaska, where President Nixon's show of friendship went some way towards lessening the growing trade war. Hirohito also flew to London, where memories of the Second World War made his visit controversial. From the airport, he took the royal train to Victoria Station, where he was met by the Queen and leading members of the government. The Emperor and Empress Nagako drove in state from Victoria Station to Buckingham Palace. They were watched by a large but curiously quiet crowd. Prisoners of war of the Japanese had called for a boycott of Japanese goods in protest at the Emperor's visit. It was a year of change for the British. After centuries of dealing in pounds, shillings and pence, they found themselves trying to cope with a new decimal currency. The authorities claimed that the changeover had gone well, but many people had difficulty understanding the new system.
£7, 8 and 2, 10.
Useless, isn't it? I mean,
It's all right.
if you say so, dear. Here, hang about. This needs glasses. Is there a smaller one than that? Yes. Oh. Yeah, bloody hell, can you get a smaller one than that?
Thank you. Thank you. Another one. That's three. Come on, another one.
And that's equivalent to 5 minutes.
No, this is 3 new pence, I gave you 5. Oh, I see, yeah. Okay. Okay.
Although the old shilling and 2-shilling coins were still in use as 5 and 10 pence pieces, the old penny was no longer legal tender, and hundreds of thousands were melted down by the Royal Mint. The arguments for and against Britain joining the common market continued unabated. Prime Minister Heath was firmly committed to membership of the EEC.
For it is not only our own well-being, but that of future generations that will be jeopardized. But if we succeed, then we shall have shown ourselves worthy successors of those who, through the centuries, have built the institutions, the traditions, and indeed the very civilization itself of Western Europe.
Not everyone agreed, especially the farmers, who felt threatened and went to Central Hall, Westminster, to express their misgivings. Their cause was championed by the veteran Labour MP, Michael Foot.
You can't build democracy in Europe on the basis of betraying democracy in Britain. That's not the way to do it.
Nevertheless, after a year's tough bargaining, agreement was reached.
You can turn it into a loving cup. You can have the other side of the glass.
Geoffrey Rippon, Britain's negotiator, was delighted.
If I may borrow a phrase, it's just the end of the beginning. And for Europe, it really is, I believe, a day which all the countries concerned and all the people in them will regard as a day which ensured for them all greater stability, greater progress, and greater prosperity in the years ahead. I mean, I've no doubt of that myself.
In Northern Ireland, street battles, bombings and ambushes became daily occurrences in Belfast and Londonderry. British troops, once welcomed as peacemakers, were now the object of bitter hatred from the Catholic minority. The first soldier was killed, and they started using rubber bullets against the rioters. Cars and lorries were set on fire virtually every night. An unidentified IRA spokesman gave a chilling warning on television. His message was, "It is a policy of the Irish Republican Army to defend the minority of northeast Ulster, and we will defend this minority against attack from wherever that attack comes." As internment was introduced in the province, the IRA stepped up its offensive. Women were tarred and feathered for fraternizing with British troops, and many were forced to leave their homes after intimidating threats.
Well, there's a number of different ways in which people are intimidated. They're intimidated by people of the other side, as it were, who come in and frighten them, and they have to get out because they're scared and they feel that they're exposed to attack. And then there are people of their own side who come along and say it's going to be dangerous around here and you had better get out, and encourage them to get out, and in fact create a sort of situation of hysteria in which they've got to get out. And then there are those who are perhaps have not been approached by anybody who now are very afraid by the total situation, and they leave of their own accord.
Pub bombings became commonplace. In one such outrage in Belfast, 15 people were killed and 13 more injured. The IRA were not the only bombers who were active. An extremist group, the Angry Brigade, bombed the home of Robert Carr, the Secretary of State for Employment.
The first one I heard was when I was in the sitting room with my wife and younger daughter. And they'd just put on a gramophone record, and I'd just opened my box to do my evening's work. And luckily, the room we were in was not affected at all, not even the windows blown out. It was just a very heavy explosion, followed by the shattering glass and all the noises that one remembered back from the war years.
In Berlin, negotiations between East and West eased restrictions on visiting across the wall. Direct telephone links were also re-established after 20 years. And Chancellor Willy Brandt's efforts to lessen tension between East and West won him the Nobel Peace Prize. But barbed wire lay the length of the border with the DDR, and while some could peer across to the other side, others made desperate bids for freedom. The Soviet Party leader, Leonid Brezhnev, went to France in an effort to improve relations between the two countries. He was greeted by President Georges Pompidou amid high security and considerable ceremonial. But there was little ceremonial for Brezhnev's predecessor, Nikita Khrushchev, who had lived in obscurity since being deposed in 1964. His funeral was discreet, and his death was kept secret for 2 days. In the Middle East, tension continued to run high between Israel and her neighbors. The Jordanian army had cleared the Palestinians from all the areas adjoining Israel, but there was a constant threat of raids. Confrontation continued across the Suez Canal. President Sadat of Egypt warned that war with Israel to recover territory occupied in 1967 was coming closer, and both sides increased their vigilance. Many of the Palestinians, including over 9,000 guerrillas expelled from Jordan, took refuge in Syria, where the government kept them under strict control in massive camps. In Uganda, President Milton Obote was overthrown by a coup led by his army commander, General Idi Amin. Obote was at the Commonwealth Conference in Singapore at the time. In Sudan, President Mohamed Nimeri was restored to power 3 days after being overthrown by a Russian-backed coup. Nimeri had regained power with the help of Libya and Egypt. Relations between those countries and the Soviet Union cooled noticeably. The leaders of the aborted coup were executed. There was also an unsuccessful coup in Morocco. The army stormed the summer palace of King Hassan and killed 93 of his guests. The revolt was quickly suppressed, and 10 of the rebel leaders were executed as Hassan charged Libya with complicity in the plot. Britain and Rhodesia finally reached a constitutional settlement when Sir Alec Douglas-Home met Premier Ian Smith in Salisbury. Months of negotiations, led by the British lawyer Lord Goodman, had brought the two sides together on the future of Rhodesia, which had illegally declared itself an independent state 6 years before. During the intervening years, sanctions had been imposed on Rhodesia, but outwardly they hadn't appeared to have much effect in Salisbury. But the sanctions had led to widespread unemployment among the black Africans, and there were doubts whether the new settlement had solved their demands for majority rule. Rhodesia's tobacco industry had also been affected by the loss of world markets. Nonetheless, agreement between the two governments was reached in principle, and the foundations laid for what was to become a new country, Zimbabwe. The Commonwealth Conference that year was held in Singapore. Edward Heath, despite his troubles at home, was cheerful enough when he arrived. The conference was dominated by the proposed British arms sales to South Africa, to which there was strong opposition from all the African states, and by the naval situation in the Indian Ocean, arising out of the growing Soviet presence there. Leading the opposition to Britain were President Julius Nyerere of Tanzania and the Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. Nevertheless, President Nyerere remained optimistic about the future of the Commonwealth.
I must go on hoping. Again, it would be wrong to say I've seen signs, but there has been a kind of pleading about the saving of the Commonwealth. Every speaker so far has laid emphasis on the importance of the Commonwealth and not doing anything that would endanger the future of the Commonwealth.
Having achieved their third successful moon landing with Apollo 14, after the near disaster of Apollo 13 in 1970, the Americans launched Apollo 15.